Russia has started attacking Ukraine. The situation is confusing. Attacks are being reported from several areas. Russian President Vladimir Putin previously announced the military actions in a televised address. That will, of course, also be part of today's report. However, the focus of the Russian attacks reports is on my global channel. If you're interested in more details, please check there as well. According to information from the German press agency, the EU states agreed on the basics of new sanctions and a package against Russia on Thursday. According to information from EU circles, it is aimed at the areas of energy, finance and transport. In addition, there should be export checks for or controls for high-tech products and software, as well as restrictions on visa policies. An exclusion of Russia from the banking communication network SWIFT and export bans on natural gas, for example, were initially not planned. However, it's considered quite possible in EU circles that there will be an expulsion from SWIFT at a later date and that Russia itself will stop supplying the EU with natural gas. According to the EU Commission, the Russian state-owned company Gazprom has so far supplied around 40% of the gas consumed in the EU. According to the information, the main purpose of the sanctions against the financial sector is to cut off banks from the EU financial markets. In the future, they should no longer be able to borrow or lend money in the EU. In addition, the refinancing of Russian state-owned companies in the EU should be prevented. Their shares will no longer be traded in the EU. Something similar is planned for the energy sector. The main purpose of the sanctions against the transport sector is to cut off the supply of spare parts and other technology to the Russian aviation industry. This could have a huge impact with relatively little effort and even shut down entire fleets, it said on Thursday in Brussels. The export controls for high-tech products and software are intended to make it difficult for other key Russian industries to develop further. The country should be hit hard in the medium and long term, it said in Brussels. At the same time, it was emphasized that the point was not to hit Russian citizens. The punitive measures are aimed at those who support Putin's aggressive policies. A political decision on the package of sanctions prepared by the EU Commission and the Foreign Service is to be made at a special EU summit in the evening, and that happened. The formal decision would then probably be made in writing, and we're still waiting for that one. The EU had already introduced new sanctions against Russia. Those affected include Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, Economics Minister Maxim Reshetnikov, and Deputy Prime Minister Dmitry Grigorenko, according to the official journal of the European Union published on Thursday night. The new EU sanctions against Russia have previously been formally approved by the 27 member states. The foreign ministers of the EU countries had already reached a political agreement on the sanctions and the package on Tuesday evening. EU Council President Charles Michel and EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen welcomed the rapid adoption of the punitive measures in identical tweets. They envisage putting the 351 members of the Russian parliament on the EU sanctions list who initiated the recognition of the self-proclaimed People's Republics of Luhansk and Donetsk in eastern Ukraine. In addition, there are 27 individuals and organizations who contribute to undermining the territorial integrity, sovereignty, and the independence of Ukraine. In addition to the two ministers Shoigu and Reshetnikov, and Deputy Prime Minister Grigorenko, the spokeswoman for the Foreign Ministry Maria Zakharova, the editor-in-chief of the state broadcaster RT Margarita Simonian, the head of the presidential administration Anton Vaino, and the well-known Kremlin propagandist Vladimir Solovyov are on the sanctions list. I'm not so good with names, sorry. A so-called internet research agency based in St. Petersburg, which is known as a Kremlin-related troll factory and spreads disinformation, is also mentioned. Likewise, high-ranking military and businessmen are part of the list. There are also the Russian state bank Promsvyazbank, Bank Rossiya, and the financial development institute VEBRF. In addition, the Russian state's access to the EU financial market is to be curtailed, and the EU's trade with the breakaway regions is to be restricted. Any person or entity placed on the EU sanctions list will have their assets in the EU frozen. In addition, listed persons are no longer allowed to enter the EU, and no more business can be done with those affected. According to the EU, punitive measures are now in place against 555 people and 52 organizations for violating Ukraine's territorial integrity. Corona-infected people in England no longer have to isolate themselves since Thursday. This ends all corona measures in the largest part of Britain. With the move, Prime Minister Boris Johnson is adapting the way he deals with COVID-19 to that of other colds. Johnson said at a press conference earlier in the week that the government is relying on infected people to behave independently and to call in sick in the event of a symptomatic illness. Let's learn to live with the virus and continue to protect ourselves and others without restricting our freedoms, said the Prime Minister. From April 1st, there will also be no more free tests. Experts were concerned. A group of scientists who also work for the SAGE advisory body warned that the end of mandatory isolation and freely available rapid tests could lead to a return to rapid epidemic growth. The modeler said that infections could increase by 25 to 80%. The opposition accused Johnson of wanting to pacify critics in his own party with this decision. The lifting of the obligation to isolate was also overshadowed by the corona infection of British Queen Elizabeth II. Health policy in the UK is a matter for regional governments. Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland have always chosen a slightly more cautious path than the largest part, England, which is decided by the central government in London. In Scotland, almost all corona measures should end on March 21st. The obligation to isolate those who have tested positive should remain in place for the time being. In the trial of Italy's former Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi for bribery, defense witnesses testified about the 85-year-old. "I see him as a great debt for everyone," said a former showgirl at the trial in Milan, according to consistent agency reports. Berlusconi helped her to settle arrears. A singer from Sardinia explained that the northern Italian bought her an apartment in the historic center of Rome in 2008 for around 1.7 million euros. "He's an absolutely respectable and very generous person with a big heart," the woman told Answer News agency. Berlusconi's defense attorneys presented the two witnesses on Wednesday. They had never been heard of in the Ruby trials, Federico Cecconi said after the trial. The statements would have confirmed the generosity of the party leader of the co-governing Forza Italia. Berlusconi has to answer in the so-called Ruby Terror trial for corruption and bribery of witnesses in connection with his Bunga Bunga parties with young women. According to ANSA, the Sardinian singer confirmed on Wednesday that she was present at one of the so-called dinners. Years ago, Berlusconi was accused of abuse of office and promotion of prostitution by minors in a first Ruby trial and ultimately acquitted due to lack of evidence. In addition to him, other defendants must now answer for having made false statements at the time. Entry into the EU should be made easier, especially for vaccinated travelers from third countries. The EU member states adopted a corresponding recommendation on Tuesday. The Commission welcomed the decision, which updates the existing framework for travel to the EU from third countries. The change takes into account both the development of the pandemic and the growing vaccination rate and administration of booster doses. The decision also takes into account the increasing number of vaccination certificates issued by third countries that are equivalent to the EU COVID digital certificate. The new recommendation applies from March 1st. According to the update, both the situation in the third countries and the individual status of the data subject should be taken into account when applying COVID-19 restrictions. Member states should allow non-essential travel for people who have been vaccinated with a vaccine approved by the EU or WHO, as well as for those who have recovered and anyone arriving from a country on the EU list. Additional measures, such as a pre-trip PCR test, may apply to some of these travelers. Vaccinated travelers must have received the last dose of the primary immunization series at least 14 days and no more than 270 days before entry, or have received an additional, the so-called boosted dose. In addition, people who have recovered from COVID-19 within 180 days of traveling to the EU should be able to travel to the EU if they certify their recovery with an EU COVID digital certificate or an EU COVID digital certificate with a non-EU certificate equivalent to the EU. So complicated what they do. The updates also clarify that no tests or additional requirements should apply to children under the age of 6 traveling with an adult. Children over the age of 6 and under the age of 18 who meet the conditions applicable to adults should be permitted to travel. It's now up to the EU member states to implement the changes and apply them in a coordinated manner. The Commission will review the Council recommendation by April 30th this year with a view to moving fully to a purely person-based approach. The EU states can now issue proof of recovery in the EU's digital COVID certificate based on a rapid antigen test. Previously, a PCR test result was required for this. The European Commission adopted the corresponding rules on Tuesday. The prerequisite is that the antigen rapid test used is included in the joint EU list of COVID-19 rapid tests. It must also be carried out by qualified personnel. The EU states can now issue the corresponding proof. Evidence can also be granted retrospectively based on tests conducted since October 1st. EU Health Commissioner Stella Kyriakides said about this, "The common EU list of rapid COVID-19 antigen tests allows member states to quickly identify high-quality tests that have been validated by independent EU evaluation studies. By using rapid antigen tests to issue recovery certificates, member states can alleviate some of the significant pressure on national testing capacities caused by the advent of Omicron." Janez Lenarčič, Commissioner for Crisis Management, visited Niger on Wednesday to get an overview of humanitarian needs in the country, which is threatened with an unprecedented food crisis as a result of climate change. During his visit, Lenarčič announced the allocation of 43 million euros in humanitarian aid to Niger in 2022. The humanitarian and security situation in Niger is deteriorating and more aid is needed. The situation is similar to that in many areas of the Sahel. The EU is committed to continuing to provide humanitarian assistance to the most vulnerable people in Niger, Lenarčič said. However, humanitarian aid cannot replace social services, which are primarily the responsibility of national authorities. We are here to support every effort to ensure aid gets to those who need it most. This new EU humanitarian aid will target areas and regions affected by conflict, epidemics, widespread food shortages, and high rates of child malnutrition. EU funds for humanitarian aid are to be used primarily to cover basic needs, in particular adequate and balanced nutrition, shelter, healthcare, access to clean water and education for children in the context of humanitarian crises. During his visit, the Commissioner met the President of the Republic, Mohamed Bazoum, the Prime Minister, ministers, and representatives from national institutions, local authorities, international humanitarian organizations, EU member states, and UN bodies. He also visited an EU-funded project that promotes the integration of displaced people and also refugees into local communities and discussed the current situation with those affected, as well as with humanitarian organizations and local authorities. On Wednesday, the EU member states approved a new feed additive for dairy cows for use in the EU at the suggestion of the European Commission. It can reduce emissions of the greenhouse gas methane from cows by up to 35%. A scientific assessment by the European Food Safety Authority, the EFSA, had previously confirmed that the product is safe for cows and humans and does not affect the quality of dairy products. Reducing methane emissions from agriculture is crucial in our fight against climate change, and today's approval is a very good example of what we can achieve through new agricultural innovations, said Stella Kyriakides, European Commissioner for Health and Food Safety. The food additive called Bovaer 10 consists of 3-nitrooxypropanol. After the pending formal decision by the European Commission, it will be available on the EU market in a few months as the first of its kind. A 2021 report by the UN Environment Programme concludes that emissions from livestock through manure and gastrointestinal emissions account for about a third of man-made methane emissions. The European Commission presented its communication on decent work worldwide on Wednesday. The initiative focuses on the elimination of child and forced labor, both in the EU and at global level. The latest figures show that decent work is still not a reality for many people around the world, and more needs to be done. 160 million children, that's 1 in 10 children worldwide, are in child labor, and 25 million people are in forced labor. The EU promotes decent work in all sectors and policies as part of a comprehensive approach targeting workers in domestic markets in third countries and in global supply chains. The communication adopted set out the internal and external actions the EU is taking to make decent work a reality around the world. The goal of decent work worldwide will be at the heart of an inclusive, sustainable, and resilient recovery from the pandemic. As part of this comprehensive approach, the Commission is preparing a new legal instrument to effectively ban forced labor products from entering the EU market, as announced by President von der Leyen in her 2021 State of the Union address. This instrument will apply to goods manufactured inside and outside the EU, while providing the ban as such with a robust enforcement framework. It will build on international standards and complement existing horizontal and sectoral EU initiatives, in particular the due diligence and transparency requirements. The EU Commission wants to anchor corporate rules for respect for human rights and the environment in all global value chains. A directive proposed on Wednesday will oblige companies in the future to identify and, if necessary, prevent, eliminate or reduce the negative impact of their activities on human rights, such as child labor and the exploitation of workers, and on the environment, such as environmental pollution and loss of biological diversity. These new rules will create legal certainty and a level playing field for companies, and they will bring more transparency for consumers and investors. Some member states have already introduced due diligence rules, and some companies have taken actions on their own initiative. However, wider improvements are needed, which are difficult to achieve through voluntary action. This proposal introduces corporate sustainability due diligence to address negative impacts on human rights and the environment. In the future, new regulations are to regulate who may use and have access to the data generated in the economic sectors of the EU. We want to give consumers and businesses even more say in what can be done with their data by clarifying who has access to the data and under what conditions. This is a key digital principle that will help create a resilient and fair data-driven economy and will guide the digital transformation by 2030, said Margrethe Vestager, Executive Vice President responsible for a Europe fit for the digital age. The data law proposed by the EU Commission on Wednesday will ensure more fairness in the digital environment, promote a competitive data market, open up opportunities for data-driven innovation, and make data more accessible for all. The amount of data is constantly increasing, but its potential is not being tapped because 80% of industrial data is never used. The Data Act addresses the legal, economic, and technical barriers that stand in the way of data use. With the new regulations, more data is to be reused, and the economic output of the EU is expected to increase by an additional 270 billion euros by 2028. This data law is the last horizontal building block of the data strategy of the EU Commission. The data governance law, which the EU legislators already agreed on in November 2021, creates procedures and structures that simplify the sharing of data between companies, individuals, and the public sector. The Data Act, on the other hand, clarifies who can create value from data and under what conditions. The situation on the border with Ukraine is becoming increasingly tense. The European Union therefore expects that war refugees will not only flee to neighboring countries. The EU is preparing for a possible influx of war refugees in the event of the Russian attack on Ukraine. Yes, we are working on it, said the EU Commissioner responsible for the topic, Ylva Johansson, on the sidelines of the Munich Security Conference to the German press agency. And after that, we all know what happened. Emergency plans have been drawn up with the member states for a few weeks now, especially with those that border directly on the Ukraine, which has a population of around 41 million. According to Johansson, the basis for the preparations are different scenarios that were created based on information from the United Nations and experiences after the Russian action against Ukraine in 2014. They did some different things with just attacks in the east or smaller attacks. Now we have a full-scale attack there, and they will need to support there. Johansson named Poland, for example, which borders directly on Ukraine, as probably the most important flight destinations in the EU, but also Italy, Germany, and France. She did not want to say how many war refugees are expected in the different scenarios. However, US Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin had already given clues during a visit to Warsaw Friday 1 week ago. According to him, Poland alone could see tens of thousands of displaced Ukrainians and other people pour across its border, trying to save themselves and their families from the horror of war. Other direct neighbors of Ukraine in the EU are Slovakia, Hungary, and Romania.